top members for a number of years, and it is always such a pleasure to be able to discuss emergent and pressing issues with someone who has such a rich insight into gender dynamics at play, be it organizationally or within broader society. But there is also another reason for why Melissa and I decided to organize this event together with Judith Butler Reading Group. And the reason surpasses the starting point of this talk, which, as the description says, is inspired by Butler's question: what allows us to encounter one another? What are the conditions of possibility for an international feminist coalition? So Alison is not simply an avid reader of Butler's work, and she most certainly is very much, but she's also one of those first people in organization studies to usher in what I kind of refer to as a new era of critical work, carving out the space for a more radical research that draws on Butler's brilliant ideas. And I'm not talking here solely about her work, but about what is often more important, especially when some firm ground needs shaking up, and that is her academic activism. So in her capacity as editor-in-chief of Gender Working Organization, she started not only setting the tone for this kind of research, but also opening the doors for such explorations through her editorials as early as 2004, through inviting explorations that test the normative boundaries of gender within organizations, undoing gender, being through writing or other practices, queering organizations, sexual politics and organizational practices, which kind of materialized in a special issue she has done together with Melissa, and many, many more. So it made perfect sense, really, to invite her to also ponder with us another important issue of this moment on how business schools can gain political agency through gender working against the anti-gender movement, using some of the well-known Butler's concepts, such as recognition and vulnerability. Please be free to type your questions in the chat as the talk unfolds. And the floor is yours, Alison.
Thank you so much, Nella, and thank you to GOP and the Judith Butler Network. Thank you so much, Melissa. I won't live up to that introduction. Whilst I'm worrying about my slides, can you confirm that you can see some of them? Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm not a Teams user, and my university's just changed all their kind of computer platforms and things during the week that the marks need to be ratified at the university. So I've got one half of my head in how to use the new systems and putting in the marks, and half my head thinking about what I can say when I can't speak. And this is a photograph I took at the Women in Revolt exhibition at Tate Britain last week when I flew into London. And I was very, very inspired by the archive of feminist materials that sparked particular effective responses in me about our ongoing struggles as feminist researchers in universities and feminist researchers in business schools. And I thought it was that simple, but our feminist struggles are in all aspects of societies, in the journals that we write for, in our homes, in our friendship groups, even in the hobbies that we take part of. But none of it seems to matter, because I've been really, really preoccupied with who can speak and who's forced to stay silent particularly when gender researchers, feminist researchers, queer researchers, anti-racist researchers, and pro-Palestine researchers are forced to be muted. So as I begin my few thoughts to share today, I'm particularly thinking of our feminist colleagues in Israel who's fighting for humanity and fighting for their rights. But I'm particularly thinking of our colleagues who are hoping to stay alive in Gaza and recognize that the struggle against genocide and occupation is something that many of the institutions that we are part of want us to forget. So with that in mind, I will continue my few thoughts. And of course, yesterday a colleague from France contacted me to say that Judith Butler's peace talk has been cancelled at the Pompidou today, and they are not sure whether she will be allowed to speak tomorrow. So it seems that there are many forces that are requiring us to stay silent and to not take a stand against brutality and violence. And of course, our struggles for peace are evident, and we hope that the ceasefire will come about quickly, and hope that we can start to support those most affected. But this requires us to call on our governments who are supporting this genocide. So, if I have to say something today, and to try and make sense of my thoughts, what I wanted to say is that I'm starting to think about the ways in which we can learn from our feminist, queer, anti-racist colleagues, philosophers, theorists, and activists that have long stood against global and local violences. And that seems overwhelming, that these violences continue on such large scales, but even the micro violences that we conduct to each other, even in feminist circles. And I'm very aware of my part in that. I'm also thinking of the decades of gender scholars, feminist scholars, who have worked to raise the profile of the gendered university and the gendered business school. And I'm thinking of Amanda Sinclair and Ruth Simpson, who's written about women's roles in the gendered business school and the MBA here. And I'm also drawing on some work that I've been doing with Carl Rhodes and others about imagining what a good business school could be, if it was ever possible. But I am up for the challenge if you are, and I have learned so much from many people in this room about the work that you do, and remain inspired. The other week, I was attending the Judith Butler Network, and Melissa and colleagues reminded us of Judith Butler, who is afraid of gender. And in this video, she speaks of her forthcoming book, and reminds us that the assault on gender has been ongoing, and that the assault on gender is also an assault on democracy. And it was very powerful here in thinking about the ways in which there's so many conflicts between different theorists and of feminism and different movements and different people with vested interests in particular achievements. But she speaks that whilst we are looking down and thinking about our inside battles with each other, the struggles between each other, that we forget to look up and to be mindful of what's happening. And only last week we see that Argentina and the Netherlands have voted in far-right governments. And this is something that is wide scale, that will continue to shape our universities and our lives, and the ways in which we need to fight to retain gender as a form of politics, as theory, and to look after those that are most vulnerable. And Nella has already referred to this and particularly much of the assault that Judith Butler talks of, thank you Sergey, is against our trans feminine colleagues, and you know, we are we express our solidarity, but that challenge is ongoing, and the actions that need to be taken are often silenced and condemned by the institutions that we are part. So in thinking of a positive move forward then, I was reading recently Lynn Segal's new book, Lean on Me, The Politics of Radical Care, where she draws on Judith Butler's work on shared vulnerability. And and particularly the role of motherhood in thinking through radical care strategies. And Lynn is a feminist who has lived a feminist life within the university, and we can learn a lot from her. But she particularly talks about the importance of the interdependence and recognition, the care and support that we all need from each other and owe others everywhere. She talks about the need for mobilizing and sustaining care and intimacy in driven times. She talks about needing the sustenance of connectedness and the interconnected vulnerability that's amongst us, against the drumbeat of market-driven rhetoric that works to thwart such recognition with its illusionary assurances of individual gratification. And there's a lot there that we can take with us in thinking through the roles that we have in the feminist alliances that we are part of, and the need for the allyship from broader communities in order to bring about particular changes. And I have been increasingly grateful over the past few years for the gender community and the work that I've been doing, whether it's at Gender Work, an organisation, a critical journal, a theoretical journal, and a journal that stands against neoliberalism, market ideologies, etc. And Marta Calás and Linda Smircich write about the state of our universities and our management and business schools when they ask, using Hanker and Hearn's work, how do we move out of the ruins? And Justina pauses here, and we wrote in ephemera around crawling out of the wreckage. Applied here. Martha and Linda say, canons of community caring and concern for others, which should not be forgotten, but rather suppressed under the weight of the competitive individual of well, there's many people in the room that work against that. But I have been very mindful of the ways in which these things happen to us, even when we're resisting. When we think we're working against them, the power of the neoliberal mentality really Can you hear me? Yeah, you can. Thank you so much. I know some people had lost connection then. Okay. So in an article just published for the 30th anniversary of organisation, Carl Rhodes and myself asked, what role does the business school have in addressing some of these issues? And in particular, we reassess the critiques of the corporate neoliberal business school through Raewyn Connell's The Good University from 2019, which is a wonderful resource where she looks to the University of Hope by saying that despite how awful things are in many of our business schools, particularly, we can act to bring about shared prosperity and human flourishing. And this was picked up in the Times Higher Education in thinking about, and I thought this was interesting, that the person who shared this said, when I was at the business school, 3 golden rules were pressed upon us: trust nobody, double cross everyone, and get somebody else to do your dirty work. And whilst that's good for laughs, I know that many of us envisage that a different business school is possible if we work together. And I don't have time to rehearse those critiques of the business school, but some of the people that have worked in this space raise the way in which the universities that I've been part of have normalized and internalized a neoliberal metrical governmentality in which quality, freedom, and societal benefit risk being exchanged for quantity, managerial control, and status benefit. And also Emmanuel Amandalaki and Agnesh Prasad talk about the ways in which this affects our colleagues differently in terms of gendered rest, and I would add class lines, and the ways in which people, particularly migrants working in different countries, have been subjected to various forms of discrimination. And of course, this will rise with far right and extreme right governments. And our colleagues Rebecca Lund and Yanni Tianari have argued recently about the ways in which the gendered university has been writing its way through us when we display oneself competently detached from the local while advancing one's career is connected to performing a form of masculinity, individualistic and aggressively competitive. And as I said earlier, this isn't just our universities or our business schools. These are other gendered institutions where we see the shift, the neoliberal influence on the subjects we teach, or the ways in which we are promoting neoliberal areas of research over feminist and gender research. We can see the ways in which gender as a concept is depoliticized. We can see that a lot of our journals are becoming anti-theory and anti-critical, and a lot of the ways in which our organizations are working, from journals to our business schools, are anti-democratic. So there are various entanglements between the gendered institutions that I'm certainly a part of. But Raewyn Connell's Good University gives us hope, and she talks very, very clearly that democracy and the ability to act is in all of us. And she talks very, very clearly and inspirationally about the ways in which we need to think differently if we are going to rebuild the university in terms of having democratic governance, engagement with society, a dedication to the truth, meaning, for example, that we can even do the research that we want to do rather than the research that's manufactured for various interested parties, creativity in teaching and research, and social and financial sustainability. Now, in applying this to the business school, I will be able to illustrate what Raewyn Connell highlights here. She talks very, very clearly about the ways in which democratic forms of governance needs to address, and we extend that to the business school, that democratic forms of governance needs to address the top-down hierarchy and centralized control that we're seeing more and more of, or certainly in the countries that I work. That traditional values of collegiality and shared decision-making are seen as quaint and old-fashioned. And I'm thinking here of Ulla Zetterfix and her colleagues who've just brought out a new book on collegiality in higher education, and that we're obsessed with managing by a narrow set of numerical performance indicators, as anybody that's applied for promotion or a job might know. She talks about we need to become more engaged, that we challenge the ways in which league tables measure success, and our obsession with journal rankings, for example, that we need to think about the ways in which social impact on the public, on society, has become depoliticized, and the ways in which we need to think about the ways in which even the work that we do outside of the university is reduced to management control systems. And in terms of truth and being creative and being sustainable, the work that we need to do in the business school, and many of you are doing, is around thinking about the ways that we become less interested in the truth that business schools create in achieving a competitive market position through this obsession with academic excellence, and the ways in which we are allowed to have critical and open academic markets environments again, the ways in which we can be encouraged to be critical. And this may seem very banal to some of you who are in critical environments, but I'm in a business school where critical research is no longer encouraged or promoted. And finally, Raywin, Carl and myself look at the ways in which we need to think about what a sustainable university or business school looks like in addressing the ways in which labour is casualised and the ways in which universities have profiteered from casualisation. So this is the sorry state, and of course we are much more positive than I can deliver today, because, you know, Connell says that democracy is still lurking in the basic work of our universities, and Carl and myself would say in our schools, too, management business schools. We are both in business schools that were management schools. So how can we create positive and progressive and engaged academic institutions that focus on the public good, despite the corporatization that's ongoing? And how can our institutions serve the public good? But given the times, well, there are many people working in this space, in thinking about the ways in which our schools need to be more inclusive, progressive, and work towards common value, whether it's through teaching, research, public engagement, or even in the training of management. Last week, I was in a meeting where Sue Vinicum said that 62% of UK managers had no formal training, and that's quite worrying. Andre Spike reminded us that the business school is not, and that we need to think about this as we move forward in renewing what the business school is about. And Kitchener and Delbridge have been working on the ways in which we use business schools for public good out of a moral commitment to human betterment. And it brings me to think that those of us that have been working in feminist management and organisation studies, in it, around it, or in relation to it, are well placed in order to address some of these challenges within the schools that we're in. And Justina just reminded me when we were in the other room that whilst our gender our institutions, and which is why GOP is a wonderful place to be, that our networks across universities are thriving, because many of us are lost in our institutions, but we find the people that we need to work with from other areas. So in taking inspiration then from Butler, Segal and Connell, I've been thinking about the ways in which the work that Carl and myself have done in terms of thinking about, well, what's next and how we can, I guess, integrate what we learn from our feminist, queer, anti-racist colleagues in shaping the business school anew and keeping gender alive in our programs, in our research, and actually in living the life that's worth living. And Judith Butler reminds us that in living in a democracy, that means living in accordance with the principles of equality, freedom, and justice. And she talks very, very clearly, which I'm very grateful for, because as an editor, I'm finding Judith Butler's writing quite difficult right now. But she talks very clearly about our need to struggle to achieve the goal of challenging people's existing ideas of who is equal and who has the right to be free, and how we define justice. And she talks about needing to reoccupy these notions and show that racial justice, gender equality, and gender freedom is integral in every part of any democratic struggle. And that makes me start to think about the ways in which we can think in these ways, through the ways in which we move to create different types of schools. And I guess finally, to think about the ways in which fascist and patriarchal regimes are not just affecting our known enemies as feminists, but that they are affecting everyone. And we are sometimes unaware. But I remember Cynthia Enloe saying that when we start as feminists to fight amongst ourselves, we forget that this is the work of patriarchy. And we see this alive and well and promoting the neoliberal market ideology of many institutions, and the ways in which that is working against gender in our schools and our universities as research and in our classrooms. But we're also reminded that we need to move between the differences between our movements, whether it's the trans movement, whether it's the lesbian movement, whether it's the anti-racist movement, or different versions of feminist movements in different parts of the world. Because what's important right now is the ways in which we engage in the wider movement against fascism and against patriarchal violence that we are seeing around the world. But right now, our media are promoting various versions of events. And how we think about, there's a lot written on solidarity right now in our field, but how we move beyond utterances using Judith Butler's language of solidarity to think about how we situate solidarity in our experiences. And finally, then, how we can, and this is for the table, I guess, how can we, and I mean me, revise our ways of thinking in terms of organising democratically, and how we can engage in the debates of our field without letting them cripple us. Because I think there are many of us that are tired of fighting of arguing amongst ourselves. Thank you so much, Nilla.
Thank you so much, Alison, for this really inspiring talk. I can see that people are raising hands, and there is a question in the chat. So if I don't see your hand raised, please remind me. One question, really good question from Amna. She's one of our PhD students at the Open University. Thank you, Alison, for your talk. I was wondering if an ungovernable university is possible, given how governable and democratic universities do the dirty work for racist and xenophobic state agendas. There are instances in the US where courses such as genocide in Gaza and its historical evolution have been offered outside the university. do we need to look beyond university at this point, than trying to fix this broken system? And I think that this kind of question links it into something that I was also thinking as you were talking is, do we need to consider broader network of stakeholders in this kind of ecosystem of higher education for answers? Do we need to go outside, as Amna said, outside of university to try to kind of fix the problem? Alison.
Thank you. I left the meeting and I came back. I don't know whether you noticed, but I don't know whether I got all of it, but I definitely got the end bit. Yeah, and I think there are lots of people in various institutions that absolutely think that being inward focus and myopic in terms of what we're doing inside the university is a short-term strategy, and that our best work needs to be right now lobbying government. Whether, you know, it's in terms of where we receive our research funding from in the UK context, or whether it's lobbying the government against, the lack of recognition for Indigenous people in Australia, which is something that we've seen recently and something that my colleagues won't get over and is already affecting what we do. So yeah, I think absolutely wider stakeholders from community groups right through to government, and your work certainly shows that, Nella.
Thanks, Alison. Any other question? I have a few myself, but Melissa.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for hosting this, Nella. It's amazing. And Alison, just thank you so much for your wonderful talk. As always, you are just so thoughtful. Your insights, your inspiration just gives the rest of us hope. It gives us an anchor point. And just, you know, thank you for sharing all of these thoughts with us, and of course your ongoing work. I was thinking back to your references to the work of the Care Collective and the Care Manifesto, which I think is really increasingly starting to resonate with so much of the activism that you're talking about, and so much of the normative critique and the theoretical work. And then I loved the points that you outlined at the end for us there about possible ways forward, because, you know, we get to the point where we think, what can we actually do to make our own lives and the lives of others better through the work that we do, those of us who are in business schools or management schools, is something which is really key to this, recognizing that interconnected vulnerability and using that as our kind of our normative basis and our manifesto for action. That's work. It involves, well, as you well know, because you've been doing so much of it for years, it involves the expenditure of time, energy, skill, resources. It involves continual commitment. But that's never recognized as work. So whether it's mentoring colleagues, it's supporting people, it's giving developmental feedback to people, it's organizing spaces where we can share experiences and ideas. This is work, but it's not recognized as work. So just as in life outside of business schools, recognizing that care is work, is that also important to what we do within these spaces?
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa, and you can answer this better than I can. And as one tired person to many others here, I think that the work of feminist researchers is the labour that's involved, but also for other colleagues to actually take that labour when we can't do it anymore. So I think, you know, the spaces that are created that are very nourishing for me are feminist spaces. but that work needs to proliferate into other spaces. So whilst there's lots of work going on regarding changes to whether it's performance management systems or mentoring for early career researchers within universities, or whether it's challenging the corporatization and the violence within particular universities, feminist researchers are often on the margins of some of those discussions because those people themselves don't want to openly acknowledge that they're gender or feminist researchers. And I think that's adding to some of our problems. So we start to see in call for papers or whatever, the feminist researcher, whether it's Judith Butler or Povinelli or whoever, attached to support feminist concerns, but the feminist researchers within our field are not attributed as having even worked with them. So I think there's a kind of polarization between the work that we do as feminists and the work that's being done in the mainstream critical body that uses feminist work outside, but then doesn't acknowledge that work that's being done by feminist researchers. But also, yes, it's tiring. It requires ongoing work. I think we see a trend of people moving away from that work, particularly post-COVID. The care work that many of us did through COVID was completely unrecognized and requires lobbying even post-COVID, because the effects of COVID are still ongoing. And it's trying to make a difference where we can. And it can be as much as just breaking that silence. It can be as much as interrupting a meeting, or it can be the ways in which we even fill out our performance appraisal, or not even doing it. So I think that there are small revolutions that we can happen whilst we're working towards other projects. And a personal anecdote: if there's a pay gap in the institution, I currently work. Is there anybody from my institution here? I work 3 days a week doing my university job because that's my pay gap, and then I work in the community 2 days a week on projects that matter to me, but actually affect the most vulnerable people in society. So I think it's about how do we use our roles in business schools to work for change elsewhere, but also how do we demand of our business schools that they are doing this social impact work genuinely and authentically, rather than as a metric of social impact. So lots there, but yeah, I don't really have an answer to it requires work, and do we have to keep doing it? Because Lynn Segal says this is the job, isn't it? This is what we do.
Thank you so much. You're muted,
Really
Melissa.
inspirational. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I've been to her book launch recently, Lynn's book launch, and I do have a question if we have time at the end.
Oh.
But now, sorry.
Marianne.
Yeah, Marianne and then Georgina first.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Alison, for again a very inspiring talk. I'm not going to repeat the gentle words of everyone else, but it was very lovely to hear your talk. I wrote down some notes, some things that caught my attention. I will try to put it together. I'm not sure if it will eventually lead to a very specific question, but I was just thinking about how you said that living in a democracy is living in accordance with equality, and how a good university or business schools should be, in fact, democratic. And then I was thinking about, well, we know actually that, and that is also the problem, that we are not very democratic, and that there are a lot of power relations going on within universities and business schools. And that will be ongoing because a lot of us are in temporary contracts, and there will always be a very strong power relation between those in temporary contracts, depending on those who have like a steady position. And that makes a very toxic place for some. And then also reminding, like Judith Butler at one point also states, like, we are all vulnerable, but at the same time, this vulnerability is unequally divided. And of course, that makes that some of us are remained silent and cannot speak up. And then I'm thinking especially of those who are still in this very temporary contract and depending on others. So then I was just wondering, how can we move towards these kind of safe spaces and become solidary? How can we enact this kind of solidarity if you're like in a very insecure position? And how can we make sure that there is a safe space for everyone, not just amongst those who can in fact speak up? And how can we include those that remain silent? If that makes any like
Yeah, no, I was listening to you. I was enjoying that, Marian. And yes, you're absolutely right. I think on the first point, there are lots of colleagues who are working to remove the precarity in their institutions. And there are examples of that because making or transferring those precarious contracts to permanent roles is a priority for many people in some universities. So I think that's happening in pockets. But it's very, very difficult, isn't it, when we're in toxic environments and we are unable to challenge and we are performing the roles that are expected of us, and knowing that parts of us are dying inside because that's the performance that we have. And on the second point, how do we include people? I guess you can never include people, but you can create the spaces, and you can create activities. And I think GOP, that's what Nella has done at the university. It started very small, Nella, and it got big very, very quickly. So I think, some people attend and stay silent. That's okay. I think it's how we act to protect those people most vulnerable, those people that, don't get the permanent position, those people that are subjected to violence within the universities. And I know there's been lots of cases where feminist researchers have worked to address violence in their institutions, and they are no longer working there for various reasons. So I don't have any answers, but I think we keep organizing. We keep meeting. Different people keep bringing people along, and then we decide what are we going to do next in terms of formalizing these networks that different people can be part of. And of course, many people don't want to be part of the networks that we create because they're creating different networks. But how we speak to each other and gather momentum by bringing those networks together, I think, is really important in resisting the ways in which we are being reduced as gender researchers, not even feminist researchers or critical researchers. The threats to critical management studies have never been greater. People want to close us down, and they are succeeding in many parts of the world. So I think there are critical bubbles, but critical management studies is under threat. And as a feminist researcher within that, whatever complaints we have about critical management studies, I think we need to be working to protect that space, because without it, we don't sit anywhere then as feminist researchers. And different people would disagree, with that statement, but I think we've got to be working to safeguard spaces that people in the 80s created, because even people with who are aligned with whether it's critical management studies or feminist organization studies are doing a really, really good job of taking these spaces away from us.
Thank you so much, Alison. Yeah, this cross-fertilization of spaces is really not only desirable, but really necessary at the moment, which is why Melissa and I kind of decided to do this together. I am aware that this is officially the end of the session, but if people have a bit more time, considering we started late, we have a question from Georgina as well, and maybe we can take a couple more.
Hi, I'm Georgina Holmes. I'm a lecturer in politics and international studies at the OU. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment, because in my experience over the years, I've moved across different disciplines. So politics and IR is my last disciplinary home that I'm currently in. And I found that over the years, feminists themselves have become, as we've talked about, far more competitive, particularly in politics and IR. And they are behaving, in some instances, some of the more kind of younger ones that are maybe rising stars are starting to develop their own networks within the kind of feminist network and becoming exclusionary. And it's a problem. I know someone who had undertaken a really good PhD. The professor that had graded her had said that it was outstanding, hadn't read anything as good as this for such a long time, but her decision was to leave academia because she couldn't cope with the competition among the feminists that had decided to exclude her because they obviously saw her as a threat. And there's something about this, because these feminists that are in my field that are coming up through the system have gender scholars as PhD supervisors. So whereas some of us might have not had gender scholars because there weren't so many at the time, these are ones that are being trained to learn and operate in the system by feminists and gender scholars. So, I really feel that we need to actively be aware of how we are training PhD students to become lecturers and to become researchers, and because we always talk about how feminist networks, they're so welcome, we're so supportive, we're talking about it now, but it's an assumption, it's not necessarily the reality. And there is something about just constantly being mindful and aware of our behaviours, because sometimes, the neoliberal patriarchy mindset kicks in without people realising, and at other times they're actually strategically operating using that mindset. And so, there's something about how do we train our researchers, but also how do we go about our daily lives, constantly checking ourselves, in the way that we should check ourselves against racism or, any other form of discrimination.
Thank you for that. I think you've explained that perfectly, and I'll just give a very brief illustration where people are, somebody saying here, gatekeeping is central to academia. And that, when we're busy looking at particular networks and the ones that are known to us, we forget other networks who are working to dismantle us. And there's been a case this week where a feminist researcher has created a whole new self-interested program of research by limiting those with gender expertise and promoting those without it. And this makes me angry. I want to cry. It means that decades worth of research in building something will disappear unless we mobilize against this force. It takes one person to dismantle hundreds, thousands of people's work. And we never know who they are. So, it's really important that we train people against those individualistic values. And I hear you about being in politics. If you were in Australia, you'd probably be sitting in the business school and you'd be teaching power and organizations using Stuart Clegg. And that's a fantastic book. But you get my point, that, you know, some of our spaces are disappearing because they no longer generate sufficient value. So I think building those relations across different disciplines in my own backyard are more important than actually staying close to your business school colleagues. And I apologize if there's anybody here from there.
So thanks so much. And yeah, like a really important question, Georgina. Nancy also said something similar about how our universities and business schools are having a model for what good fit in and is, and it's usually based on this kind of scientific macho type of person, rather than someone who has what is considered to be soft skill, like being sensitive to gender equality, for instance. I don't see any raised hands, so I'm wondering if you said something important about care, and I read that book, Radical Care by Lynn Segal, Alison, and I've been thinking a lot about it in relation to your talk, and I recognized there is this. There are two big kind of obstacles to attaining gender equality in our business schools. One is this kind of wholesale push towards kind of greater EDI, which I thought at first, oh, wonderful, finally, finally. You know, universities and business schools have sobered up and embraced EDI as a principle of good life and good practice. But actually, this is increasingly turning into kind of a neoliberal exercise where people from the outside are brought in to decide what EDI means. And the people who have been researching it and practicing it for years are left behind. And then socially, kind of bottom up, we have this oppression Olympics driven by identity politics that Lynn Segal recognizes in her book. So I was just wondering, how can we perhaps go beyond this superficial expression of solidarity, superficial approach to gender equality, to attain something that is more sustainable and kind of to exercise the care that is more sustainable in business school. I know you said something about a little bit about spaces such as GOP, which is important, or Judith Butler Reading Group. But I am wondering also about other spaces such as journals and, you know, perhaps kind of other different spaces that I could not think of that could potentially play an important part.
Yeah, well, this is why a journal like Gender Work and Organisation has been and will continue to be, I hope, at the forefront of challenging normative accounts of gender. Because, you know, what's palatable to publishers and to universities is that we start talking about women in management, as opposed to the difficult and politicized work that we've been doing around gender theory, gender politics, you know, queer troublemaking, trans feminism, etc. But I guess those subjects don't make money, so we need to be very, very careful that all of our institutions recognize that important work that's being done in these spaces in terms of staff well-being, but in journals in terms of not going backwards, that generations of scholars and students coming forward no longer have language to use, that many people have worked hard to integrate in everything that we do.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. So is there anyone else who would like to squeeze one more question? And I think then we have to sadly disband also, although I am now ready to leave. Any other questions? Comments? Okay. A lot of thank yous in the chat. I will share these after the session. Just so you know, we will download this session and upload it to the GOPS page, so you can return to it should you need it, use it as a resource, educational resource, activism resource, whatever. And another kind of tiny point to mention, there will be an International Women's Day conference with wonderful speakers, Professor Amina Mama, Kate Kenny, and our wonderful Marilyn Poon. I can see you there. So we will be talking about voice and protest. So please do come if you can. Alison, I have no words to thank you for this. You are such a trooper always, and always are happy to come and share your ideas with us, and to do it in such a thoughtful and meaningful way. It means so much. So thank you again. Hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nella. Thank you, Melissa, and everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you. Hello, Richard. You look cold.